The pen rolled across the table like it had somewhere more important to be. A single blue pen, a stack of papers, my name printed neatly at the top. Thought the phone buzzed beside me. A message from my son. Mom, I'll be there. Need your signature. I stared at the words until they blurred. He hadn't come home for Thanksgiving, or Christmas, or my birthday. He was always too busy, always promising to visit when things slowed down. But now, the only thing slowing down was him. A second text came through, this one from a number I didn't know. It had a hospital name at the top. The kind that makes your heart step back before your body does. The kitchen light hummed. The clock ticked louder than usual. I reached for the pen, but my fingers wouldn't close around it. You raise a child to stand on his own 2 feet, and then one day, those same feet lead him back to your doorstep, not for comfort, but for paperwork. And then I read the word on the form that made my stomach drop. Power of attorney. Sometimes, the loudest way people ask for help is by asking you to decide for them before I tell you the rest. This isn't a story about blame. It's about dignity. It's about what happens when family meets the fine print of life. If you've ever been put on hold by someone you love, if your phone stays quiet until they need something, this story's for you. I don't tell it for sympathy. I tell it because every mother, every grandmother, every caregiver knows that love can look like paperwork sometimes. So grab a cup of tea, sit with me by the kitchen window, and listen to what happened the day my son finally called, and why I almost didn't pick up. And before we begin, tap that like button if you've ever had to be the strong one. The house keeps its small sounds until one message turns them into echoes. The house wakes before I do. Morning arrives in small, honest sounds. The kettle's low whistle, the clock's tick, the soft scrape of a chair when I sit. I set the coffee to drip and lean my palms on the cool wood of the table, feeling the grain like a map of years. The radio in the corner hums with familiar voices. The local morning show that counts weather and birthdays and old jokes. On the counter, a stack of postcards waits for stamps. I promised to write to my sister in Ohio. Habit is how I keep time now. Small rituals that make the day feel steady. I sweep the porch every morning. Even when leaves are few, I pin a tiny flag to the rail come Memorial Day because my Harold believed in doing that little thing. I watered the geraniums on the sill. They lean toward light, like good neighbors. There's a place set on the table by habit, 2 placemats though only one is used most days. I fold the napkin anyway. It's a promise I keep to myself and to a life we made. Sunday is my ritual call day. I call people, one by one, and catch up in clipped, loving exchanges. My son used to call back promptly. We'd trade small news about traffic and small triumphs. Then his schedule filled with meetings, travel, other commitments. He called less. He texted less. The ring of my phone became a sound I waited for in a way that felt thin with hope. There were a few big days. I remember his graduation, the day his daughter started school, and the echo of his laughter on the line is a memory I learned to keep like a warm coin. On a Tuesday, I noticed the missed calls stacked up like unread mail. I thumbed through voicemails that turned into small shrugs. A missed meeting, a late shift, a promise to call back. I left messages that were warm and brief, leaving room and not pressure. Hope works well, I'd say. Call when you can. Sometimes that's what love is, keeping space and keeping the line open. Still, absence isn't quiet. It grows like ice underfoot. You do not see until you step. The small omissions stack. A birthday without a cake, a holiday without a drive across town. Little slippages stitched themselves into patterns. The calendar used to be a chain of visits. Now it's a list of boxes checked and plans postponed. Technology keeps us in contact if we let it, but it also makes distance easier to maintain. Video calls aren't the same as a hand on a shoulder, and a smiling photograph on a screen doesn't warm your knee. I keep a box on the shelf labeled memory receipts. Old playing cards, a tiny baseball ticket from a summer when my son was 8 and we almost lost him to a neighborhood dare. Objects are anchors when voices drift. I knit in the afternoons and pause mid-stitch when the phone's tone is a hope. My cat whines between my legs like insistence that life continues whether or not the phone rings. That morning, as I buttered toast and set 2 plates for the day, the phone lit up with a message that made the house feel hollow for reasons I could not name yet. 3 words, neatly placed. I need your signature. The screen blurred for a moment as if my eyes had fogged. Centered in that small sentence was years of distance shoved into a single, urgent ask. It felt like being remembered only when the ledger needed balancing. I stood still, toast cooling in my hand, watching steam thread into the air. Habit had been my scaffold. The message was a sudden gust. How did the thread snap? When did Absinthe understand that it could come back for help, without first knitting a relationship anew? The kettle's whistle seemed small and foolish suddenly, but it was the only steady thing I had under my thumb. I dressed and left the house with my purse like an argument in my hands. On the porch the flag flapped, unbothered, as if it had long ago learned not to be surprised. The road toward the hospital felt both familiar and foreign. This was the place you visited with casseroles for recovery, not the place you expected your son's life to be negotiated. When I stepped into the hospital lobby, the fluorescent light felt too bright. The clerk at the desk looked up with a practiced kindness and guided me down a long corridor. Family rooms smelled like soap and coffee. I sat and folded my hands and felt the smallness of my chest, like a drawer partly closed. The ritual of waiting had returned in a shape I hadn't asked for. The phone in my bag pulsed with messages I hadn't expected: a nurse's note, a request for ID. Then, on the table, a form with printed words that made the world spin a little: medical proxy, consent, power of attorney. I stared at legal language, the way you might stare at a foreign map, trying to find a road you recognize. My hands trembled when I reached for the pen. It felt smaller and heavier than it had any right to be, a tiny instrument that might steer a life. I inhaled and steadied my fingers. The house kept its small sounds in my head, as if to remind me of ordinary days. The kettle at home, the cat's whiskers, the mail slot's click. Yet, in that bright room full of chairs and hard floors, the ordinary seemed fragile. The pen rolled once more across the table, and I thought, with a kind of quiet dread, about what I would be asked to sign, and what it would mean to be useful in that way. Then, the phone lit up with 3 words that changed the winter. "I need your signature," Harold used to say. "Do the small things right, and the big things fall into place." I come from a town where everybody's porch light was an invitation. We called each other by last names and nicknames, and if someone needed a hand, the neighbor brought a pie. My mother kept a jar of sugar on the counter and a list of telephone numbers tucked into an address book that smelled faintly of lemon. We were not rich, but we were held tightly enough that you learned to fold kindness into ordinary acts. I met Harold on a bench by the river, where boys skipped stones and the train sighed in the distance. He was a steady kind of man, the type who could hold a conversation and a wrench at the same time. He liked simple pleasures: a clean shirt, a well-tied knot, a cup of coffee at dawn. When he asked me to marry him, he did it without flourish. He simply said, "Let's make our life useful." I said yes. We built a life on modest things: a roof patched after a storm, a garden that fed us through lean months, Sunday dinners that made the week hold shape. Harold taught me that the small tasks mattered because they added up. "Do the small things right, and the big things fall into place," he'd say, tapping his palm like a metronome. That idea became our family creed. It meant showing up, not because of obligation, but because someone's life depended on your presence. We raised our children to be independent. I wanted them to fly from the nest with confidence. Harold said independence is good, but don't confuse it with indifference. Our son took that lesson to heart. He grew ambitious and careful, the kind of man who made plans and kept them, often at the cost of family dinners and slow Sundays. When he moved for work, we wrote letters and tried to learn his new rhythm. He called less and made excuses more. Pride is a funny thing. It keeps you moving forward, and sometimes it takes the path of least humility. To me, family obligation and civic duty were braided. We didn't separate who we were at home from who we were in the town hall. Volunteering at the school meant bringing baked goods and taking minutes at meetings. Being a citizen meant being present for the small civic rituals: voting, helping at Memorial Day, mending a neighbor's fence. Those duties shaped how I saw myself, as someone who kept the neighborhood's pulse, steady with hands and a stubborn heart. When Harold died, the town showed up in ways that surprised me. People I had only nodded to at the grocery counter stopped by with casseroles and chairs. That season taught me the unspoken law of reciprocity. The warmth you give comes back when you need it. Grief was large and honest, but it was softened by neighbors' steady feet and a church that provided hot coffee and practical help. I leaned into the routines we had practiced. They steadied me. So when paperwork was placed on my table and a hospital called asking for decisions, I found the backbone built from years of doing right. I knew how to read a form without panic. I knew how to ask questions without apology. Those lessons were not legal training. They were moral practice. how to speak plainly and insist on clarity. I had learned that dignity is not flair, it's a set of habits. I never imagined the small things: dishes washed, recipes taught, hands held in the dark would be reduced to a line on a legal form. Standing in a fluorescent hospital room with a pen between my fingers felt like translating a language into which I had no practice. What I had known as steady, almost invisible labor, keeping calendars, remembering appointments, recording small bills, now demanded to be formalized. The contrast astonished me. Still, my values made choices clearer. I would not sign in haste. I would press for transparency. I believed that showing up now, despite years of distance, was part of the covenant I had with the man who had once taught me to make things useful. We had given our children wings. Perhaps what was needed now was to teach them to let those wings rest when storms were near. It was an odd lesson in humility for both of us. As I prepared to step into those rooms, I carried Harold's voice with me, steady, practical, and kind. The small-town norms, the pledge to be present, to fix what you can, to feed people, were my compass. They suggested a path: serve with limits, love with conditions that protected my dignity and his. Those were the values I would bring into a world of papers and hospital rooms, where kindness had to have armor and clarity to be lasting. I would not falter. I never imagined those small things would be reduced to one line on a legal form. You don't notice empty seats until someone asks for a chair they never pulled out before. We put our lives together like a quilt, patches stitched over years, some frayed, some bold. For decades I was the one people called when they needed a casserole, a listening ear, or a patch for a favorite dress. I taught Sunday school for a while, volunteered on the PTA, and helped plan bake sales that raised money for the town library. Being Grandma Evie was a role I enjoyed. It meant my doors were open and my presence steady. My son's career took him away. Promotions meant new cities and late nights. He became a man of schedules and spreadsheets, not porch swings. At first it felt like progress. I bragged about his achievements at the post office line and showed off his recent photographs to neighbors who asked. Then the calls grew fewer. Texts replaced long stories. The timing that once knitted our lives together loosened. I learned to treasure the times he did call, and to let go when he didn't. The first missed milestone I noticed was small: his daughter's first recital. I baked a small cake and wrapped it anyway, leaving it on the porch with a note: break a leg, love. No one came to our door that evening. The cake sat alone in its box like a quiet accusation. Later I learned they'd been at a party. Those small slights accumulated into a pattern. They were polite, avoidant omissions, not malicious, but they stung like cold rain. Technology helped and hurt. I saw pictures of birthdays and barbecues on social platforms where I had not been invited. My child had entered rooms where my name wasn't written on the guest list. I told myself people are busy, that lives have different rhythms, but patterns form when busy is the default. The calendar squares that used to hold family dinners now held meetings and flights. I kept my own calendar full of small tasks so I would not stare too long at the empty boxes. You don't notice the exact moment the rope frays. It is never dramatic at first. It is a missed phone call here, a rescheduled lunch there. The small things are like stitches coming loose without you seeing the first one give. Over years you collect those tiny absences until they accumulate into a distance you can point to. That is the slow work of drifting apart. Still, I tried to keep myself useful. I mended his shirts when he sent them home. I kept an extra key fixed to the hook. And I wrote letters that folded into envelopes with careful hand. I thought practicality would be a tether. Instead, it sometimes became a talisman that convinced the world I could always be counted on. And so they counted on me, without asking the deeper thing: do I matter? The fault line is quiet. It opens not with lightning, but with a frost that creeps toward the roots. When the hospital called and they said they needed me to sign, that small fault line became visible all at once. The idea that the one who had been too busy would now require my authority felt like a reversal of roles I had not rehearsed. It is strange to be summoned into a role you did not expect to fill, to be handed responsibility for decisions you never imagined making. I balanced the love I still had with the caution I had learned in a life of thrift and care. The documents on my table asked for judgments about treatment, about money, about what to do if the worst came to pass. It felt like the architecture of our family was being redrawn by lawyers and nurses, not by the soft, slow work of conversation we used to do over coffee. The weight of it made me consider how we prepare our children not only to stand but to return with humility when they stumble. Pride can be a good engine and a poor parachute. I had raised a son who could drive a business deal, but I had not prepared him, perhaps, for the humility of asking for help. So I sat with the papers and breathed, thinking of every holiday pie I had rolled and every hand I had held. The small daily practices that keep people tethered to one another turned now into criteria on a form. And in the quiet of the hospital waiting room, the fault line that had been there all along yawned open, unmistakable and demanding action. And then the day came when the one who'd been too busy needed me to sign his life. My heart didn't tea-break. It narrowed into one hard, sensible decision. The call came at the kind of hour when the house feels most honest, late enough that the daylight's problems are over, early enough that the night hasn't yet softened sharp things. It was Laura's assistant on the line, and she didn't waste words. "He's been admitted," she said, clipped. "They're asking for immediate consent for a procedure. Your son asked for you. Could you come?" Those are the sentences that make your spine go thin. You think of roads to dash down, of hospitals with too bright lights and too soft chairs. I put on my coat with hands that felt like someone else's, and pushed my feet into shoes. The car was cold when I started it, the heater struggling against the night. I kept my hands on the wheel and said a small prayer I have always kept in my head. It felt like tying a knot before you jump. Traffic moved slow, a river of headlights. I drove through neighborhoods that had known my family for years. The synagogues and diners blurred past, a town that had always been contained inside itself. I called the number on the assistant's message. Someone answered and said, "We'll meet you in intake 3. The voice was kind in a way that's practiced. You could tell they say that to many frightened people. At the hospital, the waiting room smelled like antiseptic and coffee. People sat with the kinds of faces that changed things silently. Tight jaws, small orange juice stains on shirts. A nurse found me and led me down a corridor. The fluorescent light reflected off linoleum like a sky of small, white tiles. They seat you where there is room, and then explain things you do not want to hear. The doctor was a measured man who used clinical phrases like soft rags to cover sharp edges. "He had a collapse," she said. "We're running tests. There's a potential for a procedure. We need someone to sign consent in case we proceed." She explained the forms and then handed me a packet the size of a small book. Medical directives, consent forms, a line marked, "Power of Attorney." The words on the forms are ordinary until you consider who picks up the pen. That single line, "Power of Attorney," was more than ink. It was authority, the right to make hard decisions when another cannot. My son had been too busy to return calls for years. He had missed recitals and birthdays and small dinners where we'd laugh into pie. He'd said he was swamped, that he'd call when time allowed. Now the man who busybodied his calendar needed someone to hold his life on paper. He was in the next room, pale and breathing with a machine's aid. He opened his eyes when I walked in, and for a second we sat like two strangers sharing a bench. "Mom," he said, voice ragged, "I didn't want to call, but I need you." It was so simple it almost hurt. No explanation, no prelude, just that small, human admission. My hand shook when the nurse pushed the pen to me. I felt the weight of all the afternoons I'd ironed shirts, of the nights I'd sat up and tended fevers, of the quiet ledger of care I'd kept for 40-odd years. I thought about what it meant to sign something that could end a fight or extend a fight. That's when my heart narrowed into one hard, sensible decision. I would be there. I would do what was necessary. I would not let the fact he'd been absent mean he died alone. The pen hovered, the paper looking suddenly like the map of a life. I inhaled and asked in a voice I hoped was steady, "If he can't speak for himself, what are my options?" The nurse explained in clear, practical sentences. There were treatments, interventions, durations, and limitations. She showed me where to initial for consent, where to leave decisions to the doctor, and where, if I wished, to leave authority to someone else. Asterisk, asterisk, the forms were precise. My feelings were not. I thought of Harold and how he would have nailed something to the porch if the world had seemed out of joint. For now, I kept my thumb over the pen like it was something precious and fragile. Then I read the clause about life-sustaining treatment, and felt the room tilt. And when I read the clause about life-sustaining treatment, I asked the nurse, "What if he won't talk to me?" Being needed can feel like rescue until you realize it's also responsibility. He blinked when I entered, and for a moment he looked younger than the man I'd raised. The monitors beeped a gentle rhythm, and a curtain swayed as a passing nurse went by. "Mom," he said, and that small word was both relief and accusation. Sorry, I didn't call. Work. I thought I could handle it. Those words settled like dust. Too busy, I thought, but he said it like a confession, not an excuse. There are admissions that are small repairs, and there are ones that begin to open the roof. Phones started to buzz with messages, Laura calling relatives, a cousin chiming in, a niece asking if anyone had set up a group chat. Family texts have a funny life of their own, typed like hushes, distributed like small announcements. He's stable. One read. We're heading over. Another. We should talk about power of attorney. That last one sliced through the room like a blade. A hospital social worker sat down across from me with an air of practiced gravity. Mrs. Evans, she said, my maiden name still sounds natural in her mouth. We need to be clear on what signing means. It's legal power to make decisions. It carries responsibility and potential liability. We can walk you through it. She placed a folder on the table and opened it like you might open a map to unfamiliar territory. The more we unrolled the facts, the more the small family friction felt like it had legal teeth. If I signed as the medical decision maker, I could consent to a major surgery. I could refuse treatments. I could direct doctors in a way that would change bills and futures. The weight of the pen had broadened into a weight of consequence. Outside the curtain, a nurse mentioned to another nurse that a business account had been frozen, and someone called about missed payments. An administrative voice echoed in the hall, practical, not unkind about billing inquiries. The world had a way of adding practical realities to human crisis. Suddenly, our family's private ledger was on the table. A cousin looked at me from the doorway with concern and said, "Are you sure there isn't someone else?" Her tone was not unkind, but suspicion has its own gravity. "He's an adult," she said softly. "We should consider legal counsel." I felt the edge of judgment and the protective reach for procedure. In a family, someone always worries about fairness, who gains authority, who loses it, and whether an older relative is being pushed into a decision. I stepped back into the curtained room and sat beside my son. He took my hand, fingers cool and thinner than I remembered. "I'm sorry I didn't call," he said again, and there was no deflection in the sentence. I did not say, "You hurt me." That would have been honest but unhelpful in that moment. Instead, I asked, "Did you want me to sign?" He looked at me as if trying on the answer. "Yes," he whispered. "Please, being needed can feel like rescue, but rescue is not always simple. It becomes responsibility with paperwork attached, with questions of oversight and obligation threaded through." I watched the social worker make notes and felt the tide of opinion shifting in the hallway like weather. There were people who thought I was stepping up because I loved my son. There were people who thought I might be taking advantage, or being asked to do what was inconvenient. I had to choose between doing what love called me to, being present in a practical sense, and shielding myself from potential fallout. There are places where love requires risk, and places where risk is unnecessary. This was clearly one of the first. I swallowed my pride and asked, "If I sign, can we set parameters? A timeline, oversight from someone neutral?" They nodded. "Yes," said the social worker. "We can arrange a review. There should be documentation and a plan." That idea steadied me a little. Rescuing someone does not need to mean losing one's bearings. I could love and still insist on protections. I could be the hands that hold and also the voice that asks for clarity. So I sat and signed some of the forms, initialing where needed and leaving blanks where I needed time to think and call a lawyer. The night felt long and the hospital lights hollow. Outside, the family chat buzzed with questions and proposals, and rumors thickened like storm clouds. I took a breath and looked at the man who had raised his own son with stubborn pride, and I made my decision to stay. So I asked him straight, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" And he said, "I thought I could handle it. Accusation is a dangerous mirror. It shows you what people fear you might be." Signing felt practical. Leaving blanks felt protective. I initialed where consent to immediate care was necessary. I left spaces where financial authority would be asked because money and medical choices are different kinds of trust. The hospital staff seemed relieved and wary. Both procedures require signatures and also people who will listen. Then Anna walked in, my son's ex, who had not spoken to me since the paperwork that divided the family 2 years ago. She stood in the doorway like a photograph taken at the wrong angle. Her mouth was thin. Eyes that used to soften at the sight of our stews now had hard edges. "You can't just," she began, and then paused because she was aware of the monitors and the audience. "He's an adult," she said tightly. "If he makes choices, we need to respect him." Her words were pointed and aimed at the idea that a parent could take too much authority in crisis. I remember teaching her to peel a potato once. I remember the laugh she had when my husband fumbled his fork. Those small memories warmed me, even as her accusations chilled the air. She had been angry when their divorce happened. Anger grows teeth and sometimes grows old into suspicion. Anna, I'm just trying to help, I said softly. He asked me to be here. Her eyes narrowed. You should be careful. There are people who take advantage of trust. That phrase landed on me like a Polish winter, sharp and unexpected. In a quiet family, accusation acts as a mirror. You see what people project: fear, greed, protection. The mirror shows you something that might be true and also might be unfair. My phone buzzed. A lawyer's number flashed across the screen. The cousin who was practical and smelled of pipe tobacco had left a voicemail. Maybe you should consider mediation. Mediation. The word suggested a courtroom without a gavel, a sofa instead of a bench. It implied that what I had thought was a private, loving act had now become a contested public claim. Rumors began to coalesce online. The family group chat filled with messages that read polite but carried a sharp undertone. Anyone know if the hospital needs oversight? Do we have legal power? Just making sure mom isn't being rushed. The sentiment was protective, but the undercurrent treated my presence as a possibility of opportunism. It's funny how quickly public opinion forgets context. I went out to the hospital corridor and leaned against the cool wall. A woman from church who used to bring pies squeezed my hand. We know you, Evie, she said. We know what you've always been. Her reassurance steadied me in a way the law could not. You can have affidavits and signatures and still be chewed up by rumor. That is why community matters. I thought of Harold's crooked hands and how he would have told a tale to diffuse tension. He'd have handed the cousin a cup of coffee and turned worry into work. But this was not a hole you could fill with lumber. Paperwork and legal counsel were necessary now. I would not let someone else's suspicion define me. That night, I called a lawyer recommended by the church. Her voice was brisk and comforting. We'll need paperwork, proof of identity, and a plan, she said. We can draft a limited authorization, not a blanket power. Her words were tools, not judgments. They were what a woman needs when her good deed is mistaken for a gambit. Clarity and limits. Accusation is a dangerous mirror. It shows you what people fear you might be. It can make you doubt yourself. It can make a simple act of love look like strategy. I slept poorly, thinking of trust and contracts. I had never wanted to be in a position where my name needed defending, but here I was, trying to protect a son who had been both distant and needing, while keeping my own dignity whole. And then a lawyer called and asked if I'd consider mediation, as if my signature was a bargaining chip. Pride can be a currency people spend until they have nothing left to trade. The paperwork needed to be thorough, the hospital said. That meant finance, too. I was handed an envelope stamped with the billing department's neat font, and my breath caught. Inside were statements, past due notices, an account number that looked like a code, missing payments, charges that had accumulated like snowdrifts. I had raised this son to stand tall and industrious. He'd been a man who negotiated contracts and shook hands with presidents of small companies. To see his name folded into overdue notices felt like finding a hole in a favorite sweater. The pride that once assisted his rise may have also been what kept him from admitting trouble. That night, my phone rang at odd hours. A business partner called with an edge of panic. We need to discuss the loan, he said. He had a voice, threaded with worry, that smelled like ledgers and late-night emails. A midnight conversation unfolded where men spoke in fiscal terms, and I listened like a translator at a conference I had never meant to attend. At 3 in the morning he whispered into the receiver, Mom, it's worse than I told you. I thought I could handle it. I didn't want to worry you. I screwed up. There was no pride in that voice, on the raggedness of someone realizing their scaffolding had been taken away. Neighbors who had lent him a hand over the years now exchanged glances and cautions. Someone at the grocery store asked after his health, and then lowered their voice when they saw me. Word moves quick in small towns. Sympathy often arrives hand in hand with speculation. I felt that second-hand warm but also sharp. The hospital's ethics committee asked for an accounting of his business positions. The partner wanted to ensure business continuity. Lawyers suggested fiduciary oversight. You can see how quickly a medical matter becomes an economic one. People who had once cheered his ascent were suddenly concerned about liability and the protection of assets. I sat with the notices on my kitchen table and made tea until the steam hid my hands. The paper smelled of toner and late nights. I read the statements to understand the scale. There were missed payrolls, a lien filed that I had not known about, and a line item for an investment that had gone bad. Pride can be a currency people spend until there is nothing left to trade. It had been his choice to spend it like that, but it was my problem now. I walked into my son's room at the hospital and sat by his bedside. He looked smaller. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, and my voice sounded like someone trying to keep calm in a storm. He blinked, embarrassed and raw. "I thought asking would make me look weak," he said. I was ashamed. Shame is a heavy cloak. It presses and muffles and makes asking for help feel like failure. The more I learned, the more complex the decision became. If I signed permanent powers, I could shelter him from creditors temporarily. But I might also expose myself to anger and accusations from business partners. If I refused, they might push for a court-appointed conservator. If I tried to piece together a middle route, temporary authority, financial oversight, and a plump, the lawyers called it a limited guardianship and the hospital called it responsible stewardship. Families break over less. I had watched enough neighbors fall apart over inheritances and resentments to know this. My son's pride had turned into trouble he'd hidden. I had to figure out how to both protect his welfare and protect my name. I wanted to be his shelter, not his unthinking guarantor. In the middle of a midnight phone call, he whispered, "Mom, I didn't mean for it to go this way." The words were small, they were also everything. And in the middle of a midnight phone call, he whispered, "Mom, I didn't mean for it to go this way." Sometimes a signature is the difference between saving someone and losing yourself. They needed a decision. That's the blunt way the world advances in hospitals. The calendar sits like a metronome, and you are asked to click or decline at the stroke of a bell. A nurse came to me with a map of times admission, pre-op. Constantine said gently, "We need someone to make a temporary decision before the procedure. If we don't have that, we may have to delay." Delay in medical contexts has a way of turning into risk. The clock on the wall seemed to speed up. My heart matched them beat for beat. I told the nurse I needed to fetch documents to confirm identity and account info for hospital billing. She looked relieved and gave me a time window. 45 minutes. 45 minutes to behave like a lawyer and an angel. I drove home with urgency in my hands. The streetlights were bright, and the air smelled like rain. I could feel my pulse in my throat. The house greeted me with the ordinary domestic chorus: the cat's meow, the furnace's small complaint. I grabbed the folder with my birth certificate, tax forms, bank statements, and Harold's old checkbook tucked in a drawer, the one he used to balance accounts. I took the extra key I kept painted red and a small list of account numbers I'd copied in case of fire. Practicality becomes devotion when days are thin. Neighbors called when they heard the news. Mr. Keller offered to drive me if I needed help. Martha offered to mind the house. Those small domestic offers were a comfort I did not realize I would crave. Lifting a stack of paper felt like lifting the world. Back at the hospital, the intake desk took the documents with the slow kindness of people who have seen many hands tremble over the same papers. They made copies, verified names, and asked a few procedural questions. The attorney they put on the line had that measured voice lawyers often carry, calm, precise, slightly impersonal. She advised on the language for a temporary, narrowly drawn authorization enough to consent to the immediate procedure. With checks and a timeline, my hands hovered over the pen. I felt a strange split between saving someone and losing myself. A signature can be a lifeline or a leash. I thought of all the evenings I had taught my son to balance his checkbook. I thought of all the times he had covered for me when I forgot an appointment. Now the ledger had reversed. Sometimes a signature is the difference between saving someone and losing yourself. I said out loud, the sentence shaped by the ledger of years. That's when the nurse smiled sadly and said, "If you're comfortable with the temporary authorization and oversight, we can proceed. It will protect him, and it will give us a path forward." Protection with parameters. It sounded like a prayer I could agree to. I requested a written plan, timelines, medical updates every 24 hours, and a review meeting within a week. I asked that financial matters be routed through a neutral trustee if possible. The attorney typed notes into a tablet and assured me such provisions were common. I dipped the pen, feeling Harold's crooked hands hover like a memory. He would have said, "Keep things simple and honest." My thumb pressed down and the ink found its line. I signed where necessary, initialed where required, and left the parts that touched finances for a lawyer's framing. Signing does not end worry, it begins a different kind of work. But as I folded the paper and slid it back into the envelope, I felt a small steadiness settle over me. The choice had been made in a way that balanced care and caution. It was not complete. The next steps would be conversations, legal paperwork, and sometimes awkward honesty. I would be exhausted. I would also be present, and when my thumb left its mark on the line, I thought of Harold and how he would nod at a job done with both heart and measure. I held the pen over the paper and thought of Harold's crooked hands. Then my thumb pressed down. Truth is the medicine no chart can prescribe. I sat at the kitchen table, with the papers still in a neat pile, like birds waiting to fly. The forms had been signed, the immediate boxes checked, but something in me would not let it rest as merely an administrative act. This was about more than a procedure. It was, I realized with a clarity that surprised me, about the stories we tell ourselves when things go wrong, and whether we would let truth sit in the room with us. So I called a family meeting. I told them we'd come to the church parlor, a neutral place with good light and chairs that didn't favor anyone. I asked everyone who cared to come. It felt strange, arranging a place to say things we'd each been avoiding. The money, the missed calls, the pride, the shame. It felt like laying out a quilt and deciding to look at every square dot. It began with the medical facts. The doctor spoke plainly about prognosis and options, the way a good doctor does, frank and kind. I asked questions I had tucked in the corners of my mind, timelines, likely outcomes, what quality of life might mean for him. Having the facts made the fear smaller. Facts don't soften grief, but they give you something to hold. Then I asked for financial transparency. Someone had to say it. What was owed, what could be negotiated, who had stakes. The business partner sat with a face made of ledger lines and said what he had to say. A stack of statements shifted across the table like a quiet accusation. The room felt suddenly smaller. Old resentments rose like steam. My son's brother spoke first, with a voice that tried to be steady but carried old bruises. "You always did," he said, "but you never asked for help." The phrase landed like a small stone. My son's silence filled the space like a held breath. He looked at me, and then at the papers, and the people who had come to witness his life in a new way. Naming things aloud made them less dangerous. The old versions of our family, the neat Sunday dinners, the small compromises were still there, but they were layered now, with the consequences of choices. I felt the uncomfortable relief that comes when people put facts on the table. We could see the mess and start to sort it. At one point I asked directly, who will handle what, and how will we check in? It felt, oddly, like asking for a recipe to calm a nervous kitchen. We set a plan: temporary medical authority, with regular reviews, a limited financial oversight plan, and a timeline for review. We agreed to meet in 2 weeks, with a lawyer and an accountant. The structure felt like a spine. But my son's voice cracked when he spoke without pretense. "I thought I could do it alone," he said, and the room listened. Pride is a strange compass. It points you forward but sometimes into the dark. Hearing him say it aloud felt like the first, honest stitch of mending. People left with tasks, someone to contact the creditors, someone to arrange a mediation session, someone to bring casserole next week. The ritual of practical work steadied the heart. I felt, in that practicalness, a curious tenderness. Leadership, it turned out, did not require permission. It required a willingness to ask the hardest questions, and to hold the answers with care. But when I requested specific records from the business partner, the contracts, the ledgers, someone handed me a thick envelope with his name on it. It was heavier than the papers I'd already signed. The weight of it made my hands cool. There is always a cost to pulling a curtain open. I knew that when I asked for ledgers and timelines, it might feel to some like airing laundry. And in a small town, airing anything becomes conversation fertilizer. The first cost showed up that night in my son's face. He was embarrassed. It's a particular, sharp thing to watch someone you love shrink inside their own pride. Behind closed doors, he said things he later regretted. Words cut with fear. "You don't have to take everything," he snapped once, before softening and saying, "I didn't mean that, Mom." But the hurt had a way of curling like smoke. Then the internet did what it does. My niece, a woman with a quick temper and a quicker thumb, posted something on a family circle, a snide comment about outsourcing decisions. It had the small cruelty of social media, loud and lasting. Within hours, someone in town had screenshotted it and the gossip mill hummed. People I'd greeted for decades looked at me differently for a day or two. It stung because it felt public, and because the needle of it was precise. It implied opportunism where I had only tried to be present. A neighbor came by with a casserole, and as she handed it to me, she said, "It's awkward. People have opinions." I laughed half a laugh and told her not to worry. I had learned to let opinions pass, like weather. Yet even weather can chill. The legal route brought its own friction. Calling a lawyer, setting up a limited guardianship, arranging trusteeship, those are tools that protect but also formalize intimacy. They require naming things in ways that make people uncomfortable. Signing a limited authority felt practical, but it also announced to the world that we had trouble. I could almost hear the town tidy itself into reaction. Still, I kept going. There's a courage quieter than a courtroom and louder than a confession. It's the courage to be steady in practical ways when people want drama. I made phone calls. I sat through long meetings. I listened to my son when he apologized without theatrics. I paid attention to who needed what and who could be given responsibility without harm. The next morning, a plain envelope appeared under my door. No name, no flourish. The slip of paper inside read, "We need a lawyer." It wasn't a threat as much as a prompt. The town, or a part of it, had decided the proper way to proceed through counsel and procedure. That note could have been cold, but I read it as someone trying to do right in the only way they knew how. So I made the calls. I met the lawyer. I asked for limits and oversight. I braced for whispers. Being honest had fractured some quiet relationships, but it also opened the path for practical rescue, and for that, I would pay the social cost. It is better, I thought, to have awkwardness that heals than silence that rots. The weeks that followed were loud in a way I had not expected. Phones that had been quiet buzzed with creditors' numbers and gentle demands. Each ring felt like a new question. How much? Who's responsible? What can we arrange? I learned more about late fees and liens than I ever wanted to know. The administrative world is precise and implacable, and it doesn't care if the hearts involved are bruised at the hospital. The ethics committee called for a briefing. They needed to ensure decisions met standards, and that no one's rights were being trampled by haste. In that sterile room with window blinds half closed, we explained the limited authority, the review plans, and the oversight steps. The committee nodded and said the right things, then asked the probing ones: duration, financial guardrails, safeguards for conflict of interest. I appreciated the diligence. They treated my role with careful seriousness. Meanwhile, the business partner called from a voice that had calmed only slightly. He wanted assurances that the company would not fall prey to poor decisions in my son's absence. We negotiated language in writing, and I insisted on neutral trustees and regular audits. It felt, strangely, like writing rules for a family table: who cuts the pie and who washes the dishes. Small kindnesses kept me upright. Mrs. Alvarez, from church, brought over a thermos of soup and an envelope of church ladies' recipe copies. "For long nights," she said. A retired judge, Mr. Lenyahan, pressed his hand to mine and whispered, "Document everything." He had a way of making legal sense sound like a recipe card. His counsel steadied me. He said I should insist on written updates and a regular family council. I liked the sound of that. It married the legal with the humane. In the middle of all this, a small reconciliation occurred that felt fragile and right. My son's old college buddy, Marcus, who had once ridden bicycles with him down to the river, came by the hospital with a hat pulled low. He had been out of touch for a while, but he stepped into the hallway and put a hand on my son's shoulder like an old stitch. "We'll figure this," he said. He offered testimony to character, to the times my son had been reliable, to the moments of generosity he'd shown. Those small witnessings help when paper and policy threaten to dehumanize a person. There were hard conversations about selling a property, about pausing certain contracts, about what constituted necessary care versus undue prolonging of suffering. Those are not easy words to say, nor easy to hear, yet naming them made them navigable. We could not fix everything at once, but we could set a direction and light the lamps for the path. Then the hospital called me into a small room, paper in hand, and said there was one more form they needed me to sign, alone. There is a darkness in hospital wings that has nothing to do with the time of day. It is the kind of quiet that keeps you awake. that has you pacing thin wooden floors while fluorescent light hums like an anxious insect. I sat up nights with the forms spread around me like leaves in a small storm. Each clause felt like a hinge, each line a possible mistake. I read policies until the words looked foreign. I read about consent and capacity, about conservatorships and fiduciary duties. I took notes on legalese, and then made lists of the kinds of human things a list can't hold: dignity, memory of a life, the gentle threshold between intervention and keeping someone's wishes. The weight of a signature became heavier by how much I loved the man whose name was on the line. Harold's face came to me in those hours. He had a way of making work look simple. A ladder steadied, a roof patched. He would have told me to measure twice and cut once. He would have told me to sleep on it. But there were windows to be closed and decisions to be made. Time has a way of making what is urgent outpace what is comfortable. Doubt crept in. What if I made the wrong choice? What if I agreed to something that prolonged suffering? What if I refused something that might have helped? The legal counsel had given me options, but options are maps. You still have to choose the path. There were moments I thought of simply walking away, to let the court appoint someone, or to ask the partner to step up. But walking away felt like abdication, not of duty alone, but of the small, steady faith you hold in family. I had taught my son resilience and resourcefulness. Could I refuse to do the one practical thing he had asked? In the smallest hours, a voicemail came through that made the floor feel both closer and further away. My son's voice was small and tired. "Mom," he said, "I'm scared. I messed up. I know I didn't call. I didn't think it would get this bad. Just do what you think is right." The simplicity of that plea unsettled me. It stripped away the pretense of avoidance and left raw need. That message anchored me. It reminded me why I was here in the first place. To act out of love, not pride. It made the weight of the pen less about control and more about stewardship. You can make yourself a victim of another's choices, or you can take responsibility for what you can change. So I stayed awake until dawn, making the calls I needed to make. I spoke to Mr. Lenehan, the judge, who advised me on the language of oversight. I wrote out the protections I would insist on: a review board, written updates every 48 hours for the first week, and financial safeguards that channeled payments through a neutral trustee. These terms were not about stubbornness. They were about preserving dignity for my son and protecting our family from harm. At sunrise, with the forms rewritten to reflect those protections, I felt a small, steady resolve. For the first time, in those long nights, I believed the signature I would make could be a tool for care, rather than an act that would endanger either of us. I understood at last how heavy a single signature could be, and how essential. I made the call just after dawn. My voice was tired but steady. I told the lawyer what I would accept: temporary medical authority. Yes. Any financial control? No. Not without clear trustee oversight and written agreements. I wanted timelines and audits and a family council to meet each week. If we were to navigate his troubles, we would do it with light on every corner. At the hospital meeting, I placed my conditions across the table, like offering a meal. I could see hesitation flicker in faces. My son, pale but awake, squeezed my hand and exhaled like a man unburdening a secret. The business partner listened, the lawyers took notes, and the social worker nodded, as if we were finding a middle path. It's reasonable, the hospital council said. Temporary medical decision-making with a 1-week review, and a neutral trustee for any financial matters pending mediation. The language had the steady practicality I had hoped for. I signed for immediate medical decisions with my pen balanced between care and caution. It was a careful signature, not of surrender but of stewardship. My son's relief was visible in small ways. He spoke more honestly. He told a few truths he had been shoving into pockets about bets he shouldn't have made, about loans he'd hoped would pay off. Saying them aloud was a kind of small penance. It felt right that truth would accompany the plans. It made room for repair. There was resistance. Some family members bristled and spoke of autonomy and adult choice. I answered with the simple, patient position I'd learned over a lifetime. Love is practical. It is a set of acts that keep people breathing. It is making tea. It is signing when that's what the moment calls for. And it is also setting terms, so you do not lose yourself. The lawyer drafted the limited authorization in clear language. The trustee agreement routed all payments through an account that required 2 signatures. We set a first review for 7 days. That way there was both action and accountability. I felt heavy and light at once. heavy with responsibility, lightened by the fact we had a plan. When the papers were filed and copies handed out, someone in the room slid across a different document with a new request. It was small, almost casual, a proposed amendment that would expand signature authority to a corporate account. Faces changed in the room. The small truce trembled. I folded my hands, looked at my son, and asked, "Do you understand why I'd hesitate to sign that?" He nodded, slow and serious. It was a test of trust and a moment of clarity. I had given him terms, now he had to keep them. The meeting felt like a small courtroom, only quieter. My son's business partner arrived with a file and a lawyer whose suit was precise enough to make paper seem sharp. He spoke in tidy sentences about irregularities, about missing invoices, and decisions made without full counsel. His tone was polite. It carried the bluntness of someone who believed paperwork could fix everything. I sat at the end of the table, the hospital's fluorescent lights giving everything an honest edge. The ethics representative explained the options. I had my notes, the limited authorization we had agreed on, and copies of the statements the partner had handed over. Marcus, my son's old college friend, had come and sat across from us. He offered steady testimony to my son's character, the sort of witness that can tilt a room toward mercy. My son was awake and alert in a way that steadied the air. He did not argue when the partner described the holes in the books. Instead, he looked at me and mouthed, "Do what you must." That small, clear trust shifted the moment. It was no longer only about who was right. It was about who would act responsibly in a hard time. Negotiation in those rooms is not drama. It is patient sentence by patient sentence. The partner wanted strict oversight. I asked for a neutral trustee, limited authority, tied to medical necessity, and written audits on a timeline. We argued gently about timeframes and signatories, each side making small concessions until the language became usable by ordinary people. Standing up for truth looks like paperwork, courage, and a lot of small, steady steps. At one point, the partner's lawyer suggested expanding authority to cover certain corporate accounts. The air tightened. I said simply, "Not without oversight." My son reached for my hand and squeezed. His fingers were warm and small compared to the documents. His squeeze said more than a sentence. It said apology and gratitude. And trust. Marcus spoke for a while about the man. He knew about kindnesses and reliability that aren't on a balance sheet. That testament mattered. It reminded the partner that people are not only numbers. The partner listened. The lines around his mouth softened in a way that suggested caution rather than triumph. We hammered out specific protections. Trustee authority limited to medical and immediate care, 2-signature rule for major an interim audit in 3 weeks, and a full review in 60 days. We wrote the terms plainly. Temporary fiduciary oversight to preserve assets for patient care and family remediation. When lawyers appreciate plain language, confusion shrinks. I felt proud of the small clarity we had achieved. My son read the provisions aloud and promised to cooperate, to step back from daily operations until he could sort things out. It was a small, practical humility. He looked older and somehow older, with the experience of his mistakes, younger with the beginning of contrition. That struck me. An older nurse who had been part of our town's stories for years cleared her throat and said, "Good work, Mrs. Evans." Her voice was an odd, warm benediction. Community matters in these rooms. The presence of neighbors and friends, people who knew our family history, tilted the balance toward fair treatment rather than suspicion. We signed a provisional agreement. The document protected his care and placed financial oversight with a neutral trustee while giving him path to reclaim authority through transparency and mediation. It was not a dramatic victory. It was a steady, moral one. I felt recognized, not as a pawn, but as someone who had acted to preserve dignity. Afterwards, neighbors offered practical kindnesses, rides to follow-up appointments, pies for the nurses, shoveling for the coming snow. The partner left with a cautious nod. There was no triumph in his step, only the weight of the responsibilities we had distributed. My son squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you, Mom." In his eyes was something I hadn't seen in years, relief and a first ditch of humility. The papers rested in my bag like a small, warm stone. I drove home slow under the streetlights, thinking of the tiny, practical steps that had stitched our family back together. The battle had ended not with a shout, but with signatures and small promises. That is the work that lasts. And relief, quietly. The days after the meeting settled into a gentler rhythm. Paperwork that once felt like a storm became scheduled tasks. trustee meetings, and doctor updates. The trustee routed payments for immediate care through a neutral account. That practical work quieted the worst of the fear. My son began to visit more often. He called at lunch, came to follow-ups, and read letters aloud. He listened to doctors and took notes. Those small, steady acts rebuilt trust more than any apology could. I returned to routines with a new cadence. Kettle at dawn, trustee meetings on Tuesdays, a lawyer check-in on Fridays. The church ladies still brought pie, but now my calendar included safety appointments. The rhythm felt like a steady drum guiding us forward. Neighbors offered practical help. Mrs. Alvarez brought cast. Mr. Keller mowed the lawn. Younger folks offered rides. These gestures kept burdens light. Practical help is mercy, and it hums quietly until you notice how strong it has made you. My son began taking small responsibilities, calling creditors with me on the line, scheduling follow-ups, and reading bills aloud so we could understand them together. These tasks felt like homework for a future we were building. He did them without fanfare. We kept a simple notebook beside the kettle, where we logged calls, meetings, and promises. It became our shared ledger of repair. Sometimes we added notes about help received. Marcus drove to the accountant and folded that gratitude into our days. There were setbacks. A creditor called brusquely. Negotiations required patience. Some days my son retreated into silence, ashamed, and I sat with him without pressing. Presence, I learned, is often more useful than words. Weekends found me at the oven more often. Dough and heat soothe a worried mind. I packed extra loaves and left one at the nurse's station with a note. Thank you for the care. Small gratitudes create their own return. Appointments and audits became routine checks rather than threats. My son attended mediation and began steps to resolve business disputes. He seemed humbled and steadier. He had room again to rebuild, without rushing. One afternoon, an envelope arrived from the trustee with the first audit summary. The numbers were messy but manageable. Payment plans and timelines were drafted. I sat at the kitchen table and breathed a long, slow breath like relief. Practical after-care payment plans, follow-ups, oversight had softened the sharp edges of worry. Neighbors and friends kept being quietly useful. The high school booster club offered to clear old files for the trustee, and 2 women from church organized a roster for hospital visits. Practical lists piled into neat categories: prescriptions, meals, and mail. Each task completed felt like a stitch sewn into the fabric of normal life. But my son and I developed a small ritual. Each evening we sat with a cup of tea and reviewed the day's notes. He read the letters that arrived, and we decided together which calls to make. Those tiny certainties steadied both of us. In time, the phone no longer felt like a trap but a line for help and for joy. Then, one bright afternoon, after a trustee meeting that yielded a clear payment plan, an envelope arrived at my door. I picked it up with hands that had been steadying the household for decades. The return address was formal. The seal caught the light like a small coin. I slid it open with the edge of a spoon, and the papers inside made me sit down. People often imagine caregiving as a series of grand sacrifices. They picture sleepless vigils and heroic rescues. That is part of it. Sometimes, mostly, caregiving is a daily, practical practice. It is keeping receipts, making appointments, asking questions, and insisting on clarity. It is the quiet courage of saying, I will not sign that without oversight. I learned that aging is agency when you give people ways to be responsible for themselves and the humility to accept help. Caregiving is work, not martyrdom. It requires boundaries and a willingness to name what you will and will not do. The dignity of a person is preserved when we both give help and set limits, so help does not become harm. If you are in the position of signing papers, here are the rules I lived by. First, document everything. Keep copies, dates, and receipts. Second, demand transparency. Ask for written updates and clear time. Third, set terms. Make authorizations temporary and conditional. Fourth, insist on neutral oversight when money is involved. Fifth, remember that love and legality are not opposite. They can and should coexist. These practices are not cold. They are a form of respect. They tell someone you love that you will protect them and also that you will not enable choices that harm them. They keep the personhood of the elder intact while providing protection for the family and the community. There is a moral in this that is plain and practical. Love with boundaries. Serve with clarity. Do not let guilt drive your choices. I saw neighbors make the opposite error either. They leaped in and took control without plan. or they stood by and let isolation grow. Both are avoidable with simple rules and a community that helps one another. Finally, do not mistake silence for consent. If someone is absent from your family life for months or years, they may still be the person you love when crisis comes. That does not mean you forfeit protections or ignore the need for clear agreements. It means you approach decisions with a mix of grace and firmness. I would tell any listener this. Prepare, make a folder with powers, insurance, and contact lists. Teach your children what documents matter. Teach your friends where to call. A small amount of preparation reduces angst and increases dignity. If you are the older person, say what matters to you before the crisis arrives. I am not a lawyer. I am a woman who baked pies, led tea circles, and kept a careful ledger. But what happened taught me something about power. It is not about controlling another's life. It is about keeping them safe, respected, and included. That is the real work of caregiving, and it is honorable. But perhaps the smallest document you sign today will become someone else's lifeline tomorrow. Treat it with care, and do not be afraid to make terms. If you love someone, love them clearly. Also, talk about these things with your family now. These conversations are awkward, but they spare you chaos later. If this story nudged you, write down one small rule you intend to keep: a regular check-in, a folder on the shelf, a named person to call. Share it with someone. Small acts become the architecture of dignity. Begin today. Don't wait for someday. After the story aired locally, messages began to arrive like paper boats on a slow river. Comments came in from people who had sat through similar nights. My mother needed a signature last year, one wrote. I wish I had known to ask for limits. People shared small, practical stories, how they kept a folder with account numbers, how a neighbor helped set up a trustee, how a church lunch turned into a phone tree. The thread of replies built into a map of what neighborliness looks like in a digital age. One woman wrote, I called my estranged brother after watching this. We talked for an hour. Another posted a photo of a binder labeled Family Papers with a note, Thank you, Evie. Community action followed. A few neighbors organized a paper clinic at the library. Volunteers to help elders organize important documents. Someone offered free notary services on Saturdays. These small ripples turned private pain into a public lesson. Comments validated the hard choices I had made. People sent recipes, offers to help, and short notes that said simply, We see you. That kind of validation is its own healing. It taught me that when a story is shared, it can change how a town behaves. Then, in the middle of the replies, a name appeared I had not seen in 30 years. She wrote, Evie, I remember Harold's hands. Call me. I sat down and dialed her number. The ripple had reached someone I had loved long ago. Months later, I stood at the church hall with a stack of pamphlets and a pot of tea. The room filled with neighbors, seniors, young parents, and a few teenagers who wanted to help. I ran a small seminar on eldercare paperwork, powers of attorney, where to keep insurance info, and the importance of written timelines. My son sat in the second row. He looked quieter and steadier. He helped field questions about what it was like to live through a time when pride met consequence. People listened and nodded. Some wrote down phone numbers and dates. It felt like practical repair. We set up a volunteer roster to help elders with documents. The lawyer who had guided me agreed to offer a monthly hour at the library for free consultations. The community had turned what had been private struggle into a public service. I taught them how to label a folder and how to copy documents. I distributed a simple checklist: ID, medical proxy, insurance policy, account numbers, and emergency contacts. They took the lists and promised to return with filled folders. Standing in that hall, I realized my best days were not behind me. They had simply changed form. I was still useful, perhaps more so for sharing what I had learned the hard way. We laughed, drank tea, and planned future sessions. Next fall, I will teach a class on keeping affairs tidy, and, of course, I'll bake a pie to share. People stayed late, talking and trading recipes and numbers. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, leave one small rule you keep for family care in the comments: a folder, a weekly check-in, a named contact. Subscribe if you'd like more stories about ordinary courage. Please like the video if it helped, share with someone who might need it, and click the bell to get new episodes. Your small actions spread kindness. Next week, the quilt that remembered a soldier's name. See you next Sunday. Always, for caregivers and elders, thank you. Good night, everyone.